In 1933, in a farmhouse kitchen on the edge of a small town in Kansas, a woman stood at a big black cook stove, stirring a dented iron pot that had to feed 7 people. And the honest truth is that when she set that pot on the fire, she did not yet know everything that was going to go into it. She knew there were potatoes in the bin under the stairs, because there were always potatoes, thank the Lord. She knew there was an onion or two, and a little bacon grease saved in the coffee can on the back of the stove, and a few jars of tomatoes she had put up herself the summer before, standing over a boiling kettle in the August heat so that her family could eat in the January cold. And she knew that whatever went into that pot, it would come out as supper, because it had to. The children would come banging through the door at 5:30, with their stockings muddy and their stomachs empty, and her husband would come in quiet from another day of looking for work that wasn't there, and they would all sit down at the oilcloth-covered table under the one good light, and she would set that pot in the middle of it, and for 1 hour of that hard day, everything would be all right. You can see her, can't you? Maybe she has your grandmother's face. Maybe she has your mother's. Maybe, if you close your eyes and breathe in, you can even smell that kitchen, the wood smoke and the onions and the steam off the pot. Because here is the thing about the women who cooked their way through the Great Depression. They never stopped. Long after the hard times ended, they kept right on making those same suppers, in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and if you grew up at one of their tables, then you have eaten these meals, whether you knew their story or not. You ate them at Grandma's house on a Sunday. You ate them when your mother stretched the end of the month. They fed you, the way they fed a whole country when the country had nothing. And they did it without a single one of the machines we lean on now. No freezer full of dinners, no telephone to order from, no store open past 6. Just a stove, a pot, a garden, a cellar, and a mind that never once stopped figuring. Supper came to the table anyway, every single night, and that plain everyday miracle deserves more remembering than it ever gets. Today we are going back to that stove together, and we are going to remember 21 pot meals from the Great Depression that America has all but forgotten. The stews and the soups and the skillet suppers that kept body and soul together through the leanest years this country ever knew. And I am saving the most tender one of all, the pot that meant Sunday, the one that could make a poor house feel rich, for the very end. So pull your chair up close to the stove, and if you love these little journeys back into the America that made us, do subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because here at Forgotten Flavors, we remember the flavors that time forgot. Now, before we lift the first lid, you have to understand why it was one pot at all, because there was a whole world of reasons simmering under that single piece of iron. Fuel cost money, wood had to be chopped, or coal had to be bought, and a gas flame ran up a bill, so one fire under one pot was thrift you could count in pennies. Meat, when there was meat, was not the middle of the plate the way it is now. It was a flavoring, a piece of salt pork the size of your thumb, a ham bone that might have already made one pot of beans that week, a 1/4 pound of ground beef stretched across a family of 8. The pot was how you performed that miracle, because a pot full of broth and potatoes and beans could carry a little meat a long, long way. And the pot was patient. It could sit on the back of the stove all day while a woman did the wash by hand, and beat the rugs, and mended, and fed the chickens, and it only got better for the waiting. But there is something else you need to know, something the cookbooks never wrote down. Nobody at those tables called it poverty food. There was no such word spoken in those kitchens. It was just supper, and it was served with the table set proper, Grace said over it, and everybody waiting until Mother sat down, which she did last, always last, after everyone else was served. That was the quiet dignity of it. A family could lose the farm, lose the savings when the bank went under, lose everything but each other, and still sit down at 6 o'clock to a hot meal served with pride, because that meal was a woman saying, in the only language she had the means to speak, "We are still a family, and I am still taking care of you." That is what was really in those pots. And when the supper was cleared and the dishes were washed and dried by a chain of children with flour sack towels, Nobody scattered. The family stayed put, right there around the table or the radio, doing homework and mending and listening to the programs, because the kitchen was the warmest room in the house and the company was free. Hard times pushed whole families into one lamplit room, and it is one of the strangest, sweetest facts of those years that so many of the folks who lived through them remember that crowded little room as the happiest place they were ever in. So let's begin, and let's remember them properly, the way they deserve. Let's start with the one that carried a president's name, and not as a compliment. Hoover stew. Folks blamed President Hoover for the hard times, fairly or not, and they hung his name on everything the hard times made. The shanty towns down by the rail yards were Hoovervilles. A newspaper you slept under on a park bench was a Hoover blanket. An empty pocket turned inside out was a Hoover flag. And the supper that turned up on tables from one coast to the other, the supper made of what the relief box and the corner grocery had to offer, that was Hoover stew. Here is how it went. You took a pot and you filled it with water. You sliced up a few frankfurters, thin as coins, because sliced thin, they went further, and every bowl got a little taste of meat. You added a handful or two of macaroni, a can of tomatoes, a can of corn if you had it, and whatever else was in the cupboard that couldn't hide from you, and you let it all simmer together until the macaroni was soft and the broth had gone red gold, and the whole kitchen smelled like something was happening. And do you know, the children never once thought they were poor when they ate it. That is the testimony you hear over and over from the folks who were little then. They remember Hoover stew fondly. They remember fishing for the slices of frankfurter and trading a piece of corn for a piece of hot dog with a brother and wiping the bowl with a heel of bread. It was salty and warm and filling, and there was always enough because you could always add another cup of water and another handful of macaroni. Whole neighborhoods ate it the same week because relief day came for everybody at once. And if one family's pot ran thin before payday, a neighbor's pot ran a little thicker, and covered bowls traveled across porches in both directions. No ledger kept, because everybody understood they were one bad week from needing the favor returned. It was a stew named in anger, but it was served with love, and that is the strange sweetness of it. When times got better, folks set it aside, maybe because of what it remembered. But ask anyone who ate it as a child, and watch their face go soft. But the next one didn't need a president. It told you plainly, right in its name, whose supper it was. They called it the poor man's meal, and there was no shame in saying so. This was the skillet supper, the one-pan wonder that fed working families and out-of-work families alike, and it was as simple gets. You peeled and cubed your potatoes, always potatoes, the faithful friend of every hard-up kitchen, and you fried them in a big black skillet, in a spoonful of lard or bacon grease, with a good chopped onion. And when the potatoes had gone golden at the edges, and the onions had gone soft and sweet, and the whole house smelled like supper, you sliced in a frankfurter or two, and you let it all fry together until the frankfurter edges curled and browned. That was it. That was the whole meal, served hot out of the pan, maybe with a little salt and pepper and a slice of bread to push it onto the fork. The beauty of it was in the arithmetic. Potatoes cost next to nothing. Onions cost less. And 2 frankfurters, cut up small, could put a taste of meat into 5 plates. But the real magic of the poor man's meal was the smell. Ask anybody who grew up with it. That smell of potatoes and onions frying in a black iron skillet meant that everything was going to be all right. It drifted out the kitchen window and down the block, and children playing kick the can in the dusk would lift their heads like hounds and know it was time to go home. Mothers made it on wash day because it was quick and it asked nothing of a woman who had been scrubbing since dawn. Fathers made it on the nights mother was sick because it was the one thing they knew how to cook. It followed the family through the decades, long after the hard times, showing up on card tables at the lake cabin and on stovetops in little first apartments, because it was the taste of getting by, and getting by, when you have done it together, is a warm thing to remember. But the next pot didn't belong to one family at all. It belonged to everybody who stood around it, and it was cooked beside the railroad tracks. That would be Mulligan's stew, the stew of the road, the pot of the hobo jungles, and there was never a more democratic supper in all of American history. You have to remember what those years did to men. Hundreds of thousands of them, and boys too, some no older than 14, took to the rails looking for work, riding the boxcars from harvest to harvest, town to town, with everything they owned rolled in a blanket. And in the camps by the rail yards, in the willow groves down by the river, they made their supper together in one big pot over an open fire. And the rule of the Mulligan was the oldest rule there is. Everybody puts in what they have, and everybody eats. One man had an onion in his coat pocket. Another had a couple of potatoes he'd earned splitting wood for a farm wife. Somebody had a carrot. Somebody had a handful of beans. And if it was a lucky day, somebody had a piece of meat. And it all went into the pot with river water and salt. And it simmered while the men sat around the fire and traded news of where there might be work. Out west, up north, anywhere. And here is the part of the story that belongs to the women. And it is the part I love best. Those men came to the back doors, hats in their hands, and asked, polite as deacons, whether there was any work they might do for a bite to eat. And the women of this country, who had barely enough for their own, fed them. They fed them on the back porch steps, a plate of beans, a slice of bread, a cup of coffee, and the men chopped wood or fixed a fence for it and moved on. Folks said the travelers left secret marks on the gateposts, a little sign that meant a kind woman lives here. Think of that. In the hungriest years we ever had, kindness had its own alphabet. Mulligan stew came home from the camps and got made in kitchens too, the same loose, generous, whatever you have way. But the next one was the steadiest supper in half the country, and it simmered from morning until the men came in. Soup beans and cornbread. If you have any people at all from the hills, from Kentucky or Tennessee or West Virginia, or from the cotton country, or from the wide, dusty middle of the map, then you know exactly what I have just said, and your mouth is already watering. A pound of dried beans, pintos mostly, picked over on the tabletop for the little stones, soaked overnight in the big pot, and then set to simmer all day long with a piece of salt pork, or a ham hock, or best of all the ham bone, with just enough salt and maybe an onion, until the broth went thick and brown and silky, and the beans were soft as butter. And alongside it, always, cornbread, baked in the black iron skillet that was greased and set in the oven to get screaming hot first, so the batter hissed when it went in and came out with a bottom crust as brown and crisp as anything on this earth. That was supper. Beans ladled in a bowl, broth and all, cornbread split and crumbled in, or laid alongside, an onion quartered on the table for those who wanted it, and if the cow was milking, a glass of cold buttermilk. It fed families 5 nights a week in the hardest years, and nobody died of the sameness of it, because it wasn't the same. It was faithful, and there is a difference. And I will tell you a thing about that ham bone. In many a neighborhood, one ham bone made the rounds. It seasoned Monday's beans at one house, and was passed over the fence to season Wednesday's beans next door. And it kept going until it had given every family on the block its blessing, and had nothing left to give. People shared like that then. They shared the bone, the starter, the garden extra, the cup of sugar, because the only wealth anybody had left was each other. But the next dish didn't come from the store or the cellar at all. It came up out of the yard, free for the picking, and the children were sent out to gather it. I'm talking about dandelion greens, wilted down in the pot with bacon grease, and if you never ate them, I promise you your grandmother did. Come the first warm weeks of spring, after a winter of potatoes and beans and whatever the cellar still held, a body craved something green, the way a thirsty man craves water. And there it was, growing free in every yard and pasture and roadside ditch in America, the humble dandelion, the same plant folks pay good money to poison out of their lawns today. The children were handed a paring knife and a basket, and sent out with instructions to cut the young plants low before the flowers came, because once a dandelion blooms, the leaves go bitter. And they came back with baskets full of ragged green, and Mother washed those greens in 3 waters at the sink until the grit was gone. Then into the big pot went a spoonful of saved bacon grease, and the greens went in on top of it, hissing, and they cooked down the way greens do, a whole basketful sighing down into a few dark, glistening cups. A splash of vinegar over them, a little salt, some crumbled bits of bacon, if the week had been kind, and there was your spring tonic, served hot with cornbread to sop the pot liquor, that dark green broth in the bottom that the old folks swore was worth more than medicine. Some families wilted the hot grease over the raw greens instead, right at the table, with a little sugar and vinegar in the pan, and called it wilted salad. Either way, it was free food, and let me say something about that, because it matters. There were folks who felt the sting of gathering weeds for supper, and there were folks who held their heads up and called it what it was, good food, gathered with your own hands from ground no bank could take away from you. By the time the hard years ended, dandelion greens were a taste people were proud of, a family tradition carried on every spring, paring knife and all. The dandelions are still out there every April, millions of them, free as ever, and almost nobody bends down anymore. But the next one was the gentlest supper in the whole American repertoire, and it was made for the nights when the world had been too much. Milk toast. Now, I want you to say that softly, because it was a soft food, and it lived in the soft places of family life. Milk toast was what your grandmother made when you were sick. It was what she made for her own mother, when great-grandma's teeth were mostly memory and her appetite was small. And in the Depression, it was supper, plain and honest, more nights than anyone kept count of. Here is the whole recipe. You toasted bread, good and brown, and you buttered it while it was hot, so the butter went down into it. You laid it in a shallow bowl, and over it you poured warm milk, sweetened maybe with a little sugar, dusted maybe with cinnamon, salted and peppered instead in the households that took it savory. The toast drank up the milk and went soft as custard underneath, while the top edges held a little of their crispness, and you ate it with a spoon, and it was warm all the way down. Some folks called it milksop. Hospital cooks and old cookbooks called it graveyard stew, a gallows joke, because it was what you fed the very ill, but the name never scared the children, who would have happily eaten it every night of the week. Think about what a supper like that means. It means the flour barrel and the milk pail were the last 2 things standing, and a woman looked at them and made something that a child remembers 70 years later not as hardship, but as comfort. That is a kind of genius, and it never won any prizes, and it should have. Milk toast slipped away when times fattened up, surviving longest at the bedsides of the sick, and then even there it gave way. But somewhere in your memory, I would wager, there is a shallow bowl, and buttered toast going soft under warm sweet milk, and someone who loved you standing over it. But the next one owned the morning, the way beans owned the evening, and it bubbled like a swamp in a fairy tale. Cornmeal mush. In the lean years, the day began, in kitchen after kitchen, with a big pot of water coming to a boil and a woman streaming yellow cornmeal into it with one hand while she whisked with the other, because if you dumped it in all at once, you got lumps, and her mother had taught her that, and her mother's mother before. The mush went glub and glub on the stove, thickening, spitting little volcanoes, and you had to stir it faithful with a long wooden spoon and keep your knuckles clear, and when it was thick as porridge ought to be, it went into the bowls, and onto it went whatever the house could offer, a pat of butter, a ribbon of molasses or sorghum, a spoon of brown sugar, a pour of milk. It filled the children's stomachs for pennies and held them clear till dinner, and it warmed the whole kitchen making it. But here is the part I love, the part that shows you how those women thought. Whatever mush was left over did not get thrown out. Nothing got thrown out. It got poured into a loaf pan and set in the icebox or the cold pantry, where it firmed up solid overnight. And next morning, Mother sliced it, dusted the slices in a little flour, and fried them in bacon grease until each one wore a crackling golden crust, and fried mush with molasses was so good that children fought over it, and plenty of folks liked day 2 better than day 1. 2 breakfasts from one pot, one of them soft and one of them crisp, out of nothing but cornmeal, water, and thrift. The old country families had their own names for it, and up in the coal towns and out on the farms, it answered to a dozen of them, but it was the same faithful yellow pot everywhere. Cold cereal in a box killed it, as much as anything did, and mornings got quicker and lonelier. But before we set the supper pot back on the fire, walk with me down to the corner grocery for a minute, because that little store is half the story of how every one of these meals got made at all. Every neighborhood had one, and every crossroads town had one, the little grocery with the screen door that banged and the wooden floor that creaked, and the smell of coffee and kerosene and apples all mixed together. The man behind that counter knew every family for a mile around by name, knew their children, knew their troubles, and he kept, in a drawer under the register, the most important document in the neighborhood, which was the book. "Put it on the book," a woman would say quietly, and he would, flour and beans and a piece of salt pork written down in pencil under her family's name, to be paid when the mill called the men back, or when the crop came in, or when it could be. That was groceries by trust, and entire neighborhoods ate on it for months at a stretch. And here is a thing worth knowing. A great many of those grocers carried their people clean through the hard years and quietly went broke themselves doing it, and no newspaper ever ran their names, and there ought to be a monument somewhere, and there never will be, so let this minute of remembering be it. The children knew that store too. They were sent down with a note and a coin and instructions to bring back the change. And if the grocer was a kind man, and most were, a penny's worth of candy from the glass case sometimes found its way into a small hand for free. And the flour came in printed cotton sacks, and you know what happened to those. The mills had figured out that the women were sewing with them, so they started printing the sacks in flowers and gingham checks, and mothers picked their flour as much for the fabric as for the milling, and little girls all over this country wore dresses their mothers had cut from feed and flour sacks, and school dresses and aprons and quilt backs besides, and many a woman living today can still tell you exactly which pattern came off the 25-pound sack. When the relief came, it came plainer. Sacks of flour and dried beans and salt pork handed off a truck, and folks took it with their chins up because their children needed it, and nobody with any decency said a word. That was the economy under the pot, trust and cotton sacks and pencil marks in a worn ledger book. But now, back to the stove, because the next one answers the question every mother in America knew how to answer, which was how to feed 6 people on 3 potatoes and a quart of milk. Potato soup. There may be no dish in this whole hour that fed more American families more often than plain potato soup, and there is certainly none humbler. Potatoes peeled and cubed, and the peels done thin, mind you, because thick peels wasted food, and there are women still living who cannot peel a potato any way but thin. An onion chopped in, water to cover, a good pinch of salt, and the pot set to simmer until the potatoes went tender and the edges of them melted a little and thickened the broth all by themselves. Then the milk went in, and a lump of butter if butter there was, and black pepper, and some mothers mashed a few of the cubes against the side of the pot to make it creamy, and that was the whole of it. Served hot in deep bowls, with soda crackers crumbled over if the tin held any, or a slice of bread, and around the table went the pot until the pot was empty. It was pale, and it was plain, and it was perfect. On a cold night, with the wind working at the window sashes, a bowl of hot potato soup was as close to being held as food can come. And it was honest food for hard arithmetic, because a peck of potatoes cost a few cents, and the cow, if you were blessed with a cow, gave the milk for free. Town families made it thinner some weeks, and no one said anything, because everyone understood, and understanding without saying was half of how folks got through. Little ones learned to cook on it, standing on a chair at the stove, stirring so it wouldn't catch, proud as anything. And when those little ones grew up and had lean weeks of their own, in little apartments far from home, what did they make? Potato soup. Of course they did. It tasted like their mother standing behind them. But the next one came over on the boats, and it turned two of the cheapest things in the grocery into one of the best suppers this country ever ate. Cabbage and noodles. Every family that came from the old countries, from Poland and Hungary and Bohemia, and all the villages in between, brought a version of this in their steamer trunks, and in the hard years, the whole country found out why. Cabbage was the cheapest food in the store, pennies for a head the size of a bowling ball, and it kept for weeks in the cellar without complaint. And noodles were flour and an egg rolled out on the kitchen table and cut with a knife, or bought in a bag for next to nothing. Now here is what happened in the pot. You slice that cabbage thin and you put it into hot butter or bacon grease. Let's be honest, it was usually bacon grease, with an onion and a little salt, and then you did the hard part, which was nothing. You let it cook, slow, stirring now and then, while the cabbage sighed down and gave up its water and went from white to gold to the color of caramel, sweet as anything, because that is the secret nobody tells you about cabbage, that inside every cheap head of it, there is a sweetness that only patience can find. Then in went the cooked noodles and a shocking amount of black pepper, and the whole thing got turned over together in the pot until every noodle was glossy and golden, and that was supper, and there are grown men who would trade a steak for a plate of it right now. It fed the mill towns and the mining towns and the railroad towns. It fed meatless Fridays and end-of-the-month Wednesdays alike. The grandmothers made it by feel, no recipe ever written, and when the grandmothers went, an awful lot of the cabbage and noodles went with them, surviving mostly at church festivals in the old neighborhoods, where the ladies of the parish still turn it out by the roasting pan, and it sells out before noon every single year. But the next one wore a foreign name it had no real claim to, and answered to a different alias in every county in America. Call it goulash, call it slumgullion, call it American chop suey if your people were New England people, call it hot dish if they were prairie people. Every town had its name for it, and every mother had her way with it. But the pot was the same pot from Maine to California. A little ground beef, and I mean a little, a quarter-pound was plenty, browned in the bottom of the big pot with onion. Then macaroni, then canned tomatoes, the ones put up in August, or the ones from the store with the label half soaked off, then water and salt and whatever the spice shelf offered, and the lid went on, and the pot did the rest. The macaroni cooking right in the tomato broth and drinking up every bit of flavor as it went. One pot. One wooden spoon. Supper for 8, with seconds. It was the church supper dish and the school lunchroom dish and the firehouse dish. It traveled in speckled roasting pans to every potluck and grange hall and funeral luncheon in the nation, and it is entirely possible that no single food fed more Americans at long folding tables than this one. And every family was certain, absolutely certain, that their version was the true one, that goulash had to have corn in it, or couldn't have corn in it, or wasn't goulash at all without a bay leaf, and families have argued the point across 60 Thanksgiving tables. Of course, folks from Hungary would tell you, gently, that this was no goulash of theirs, and they were right, but America has never asked permission before borrowing a good name for a good idea. The frozen dinner and the pizza man pushed it off the weeknight table, but it never quite died, it just went quiet. Somewhere tonight, in some church basement, a 20-quart pot of it is feeding 100 people, and thank goodness. But the next one poured white gravy over the whole idea of hard times, and the men who ate it in the service could never decide if they loved it or hated it, so they did both. Dried beef gravy on bread, creamed chipped beef, if you were being polite, and the fellows in uniform had their own name for it that I will not be repeating on a family channel. In the store, it came in a little glass jar, wafer-thin slices of dried salted beef, and the glass jar was the bargain, hidden inside the bargain, because when the jar was empty, it became a drinking glass, and half the kitchen cupboards in America in those years were stocked that way, and nobody thought a thing of it except that it was sensible. The beef got torn up and dropped into a pot where butter or drippings and flour had been stirred together. Then the milk went in slow, and the whole thing thickened into a creamy, salty, pepper-flecked gravy that got ladled over toast or plain bread or biscuits. And it was rich and filling, and it cost almost nothing, because a few ounces of dried beef-flavored gravy, enough for a whole family. That was the great secret of the era, you see. Milk gravy was the multiplier. Flour, fat, and milk could take a fistful of anything. Beef, sausage, a couple of eggs, and stretch it over bread until everyone at the table was full. And on the weeks when there was not even the little jar of beef, there was still gravy bread, just the white gravy over bread, plain as a psalm, and mothers served it without apology, and children ate it without complaint, mostly. When the war came a few years later, the army served creamed chipped beef to several million young men at several million breakfasts, and those men came home swearing they never wanted to see it again. And then, and this is the truth, they missed it. They ordered it in diners. They asked their wives for it. Because it didn't taste like the army, in the end. It tasted like being 19. But the next one was the prettiest thing a leftover ever became, and it was red as a Sunday dress. Red flannel hash. This one belonged to New England, to the little white houses and the stony farms of Vermont and Maine and New Hampshire, and it began, like so much good food, as the second act of another meal. The boiled dinner came first. That was corned beef simmered all afternoon with cabbage and potatoes and carrots and beets, the great Yankee one-pot feast, usually on a Saturday or Sunday. And come Monday, whatever was left, the odds and ends of the beef, the potatoes, and above all the beets, got chopped up fine and pressed into the big black skillet with a little fat, and there it sat over the fire, patient, until the bottom formed a crust, and then it was turned, rough and glorious, and crusted again. And the beets did something wonderful. They bled their crimson into every scrap of potato and beef until the whole hash came out the deep rosy red of a lumberjack's flannel shirt, and that is the name, red flannel hash, and has there ever been a better one? It was served hot with a splash of vinegar or a poached egg on top for the lucky, and it turned Monday, wash day, the hardest working day of a woman's week, into a supper people actually looked forward to. There is a whole philosophy in that skillet if you look for it. Nothing wasted, nothing wanting. Yesterday's dinner reborn as something arguably better than it started, and a name with more poetry in it than half the books ever written. The old Yankees would no more have thrown away a boiled beet than they would have thrown away a dollar bill, and their grandchildren, who have never once eaten a beet on purpose, could stand to hear about it. But the next dish carried luck inside it. Real luck, the kind you eat on the first day of January with your whole family crowded around, and it came up from the south. Hoppin John, black-eyed peas and rice, simmered together in one pot with a piece of fatback or a ham hock and an onion, the peas going creamy, the rice drinking up the pot liquor, the salt meat seasoning every spoonful of it, and if you have southern people anywhere in your family tree, you know that this dish is not merely supper, it is insurance. Because Hoppin John eaten on New Year's Day brings luck for the year, the peas standing for coins, and the greens served alongside standing for folding money, and the cornbread for gold, and in the Depression, when luck was the scarcest crop in America, do you think anybody skipped it? Not a chance. Families who had lost the farm, lost the store, lost the bank account, still put the peas on to soak on New Year's Eve, because hope is a thing you have to feed or it dies, and Hoppin John was hope you could put in a bowl for pennies. But it wasn't only for January the 1st. All through the year, all through the hard years, that same pot fed families across the South, because dried peas kept forever in the sack, rice was cheap as sand, and one small piece of seasoning meat could make the whole pot taste like Sunday. The dish came up out of the Carolina Low Country, out of the kitchens and the wisdom of black cooks generations before, and it spread across the whole South and into every kitchen that needed it, which in those years was every kitchen there was. Eaten with a spoon, with a dash of pepper sauce or plain, with cornbread riding alongside, it was creamy and smoky and deeply, quietly satisfying in the way that only peas and rice and pork ever seem to manage together. And every January, even now, the pots come out, and the peas go in, and a whole region eats its luck the way its great-grandparents did. But the next one is older than the country itself, and its name comes from the people who were here first. Suatach. The name comes from the Narragansett people, from a word for boiled corn kernels, and the dish itself was being simmered on this continent centuries before anybody thought to build a bank, let alone watch one fail. Corn and beans cooked together in one pot. That is the heart of it, and it is worth pausing on, because corn and beans together make a whole protein, a complete nourishment, and the native peoples of this land knew that truth in their bones long before any scientist wrote it down. In the Depression, it came back like an old friend in a doorway. In summer, it was fresh, sweet corn cut off the cob right into the pot, the cob scraped with the back of the knife for every drop of its milk, fresh shell beans or limas, a little butter, a little milk, salt and pepper, everything simmering together until it was sweet and tender, and the pot smelled like a August garden. In winter, it came from the jars in the cellar. The corn and the beans a woman had put up in the hot months against exactly this cold one, and a jar of summer opened in February is a kind of time travel, and the women who canned it knew that too. It was cheap, it was hearty, it stretched with milk, and thickened with a little flour if the family was large, and a piece of salt pork could turn it from a side dish into supper itself. Some households threw in tomatoes, some threw in potatoes, and down south the pot might get okra and be all the better for it. It fed the family and offended no one, and children who claimed to hate lima beans somehow always cleaned the bowl. Succotash still makes a shy appearance at Thanksgiving here and there, a spoonful beside the turkey, but as a supper in its own right, a pot of it steaming in the middle of the table, it has slipped almost entirely out of American life. But the next one was what happened when a chowder had to be made 1,000 miles from the nearest clam. Corn chowder. Out in the middle of the country, and in every town where the sea was a rumor and clams were a picture in a magazine, the chowder pot learned to make do, and what it made do with was corn, and what it made was wonderful. You started the way every good chowder starts, with a little salt pork or bacon cut small and rendered slow in the bottom of the pot until the fat ran and the bits went crisp. Into that went the onion, then the potatoes cut in cubes, then water, and the pot simmered while the potatoes softened. Then the corn, fresh in summer, canned or home-jarred the rest of the year, and then the milk, and a lump of butter, and salt and plenty of pepper, and some mothers crumbled in a few crackers to thicken it, and the whole thing came together into something creamy and golden, and flecked with crisp pork, sweet from the corn, and earthy from the potatoes, a chowder in every way that mattered. It was Friday night food in the households that kept meatless Fridays, and it was Tuesday night food in the households that had run out of Tuesday money, and it asked so little and gave so much. A big pot of it with bread and butter fed a family of 8 and warmed the kitchen twice, once in the making and once in the eating. And there was something about a chowder that felt like plenty, even when it was thrift. Maybe the cream, maybe the butter shining on top, maybe just the word itself, chowder, which has never once in its life sounded poor. The soup pots of America got smaller after the war, and then they mostly got put away, and corn chowder went with them, remembered now mostly on the back of an old recipe card in a tin box, in a grandmother's careful handwriting. But before we head south for the next one, come down the cellar stairs with me for a minute, because underneath every single supper we have remembered today, there was a room lined with glass jars, and that room deserves its own remembering. The canning cellar. If the kitchen was the heart of the Depression house, the cellar was its bank, and unlike the banks uptown, it never once failed anybody. All through the hot months, the garden came in, and the kitchen turned into a boiler room, kettles rolling, jars scalding, The woman of the house, with her hair pinned up and her face shining, putting up tomatoes and green beans and corn and pickles and peaches, quarts and quarts and quarts of them, in August heat that would fell a mule, precisely so that her family could eat in the January cold. The children snapped beans on the porch by the bushel, and shelled peas into dishpans, and carried the cooled jars down the stairs, and the rows built up on the shelves week by week, red and green and gold, until by first frost, a woman could stand at the bottom of those stairs and count her wealth like a queen. 200 jars, 300. Folks measured their winter in quarts, and they would tell you so, plain as reporting the weather. And when a neighbor's cellar was thin, because sickness had taken her summer or a new baby had, jars walked quietly from one house to another in bushel baskets, no announcement made. Which brings us to the church suppers, because that was the other place all these pots came together. The long tables in the church basement or out on sawhorses under the trees, and every woman arriving with her covered dish, her beans, her hot dish, her chicken and dumplings if it was a funeral or a homecoming, and nobody, not once, not ever, asked who had brought much and who had brought little. The widow's plain pot of potatoes sat next to the deacon's wife's chicken, and both got eaten and both got praised, and a family that hadn't had a full week of suppers could eat their fill at that table with their dignity fully intact, because it wasn't charity, it was fellowship, and the difference between those two words was the whole social genius of the American church supper. But now, up the stairs and back to the skillet, because the next one came from the south, and it proved that a spoonful of drippings and a jar of home-canned tomatoes could baptize a biscuit into glory. Tomato gravy and biscuits. Now, if you are from the south, or your mother was, or her mother, you just sat up a little straighter, because tomato gravy is one of those foods that divides the world into the people who know and the people who missed out. It went like this. In the black skillet where the morning's bacon or sausage had been cooked, in those precious drippings, a spoonful or two of flour got stirred and browned. Then in went the tomatoes, home-canned mostly, juice and all, crushed up with the spoon, and then a little milk in the versions that took milk, and the whole thing bubbled and thickened into a gravy that was tangy and rich and the color of a sunset, with little crisp bits from the skillet bottom stirred all through it. And it got ladled generously over split biscuits, yesterday's biscuits warmed over, or that morning's fresh, and that was breakfast, and plenty of times, in the hard years, it was supper too. Breakfast for supper was one of the quiet tricks of Depression cooking, because breakfast foods were the cheap foods, flour and drippings and whatever the hens allowed, and a mother could put biscuits and tomato gravy on the table for pennies, and nobody at that table felt shorted, because it was delicious, and it was hot, and there was plenty of it. The old cooks never washed that skillet, you know, just wiped it out and hung it up, because the seasoning in that black iron was an inheritance, handed down like the family Bible, and a bride who scrubbed her mother-in-law's skillet with soap only ever made that mistake once. Tomato gravy faded as drippings cans disappeared from stovetops, and biscuits started coming from the store. But there are still kitchens, here and there, where it happens on a Saturday morning, and if you are ever invited to one, you go. But the next one was so humble that its main ingredient was rubbed off a woman's fingertips, and it fed the plain people of Pennsylvania for 200 years. Rivel soup. The Pennsylvania Dutch made it, the plain farming people of the German country, and from there it traveled wherever they traveled, out through Ohio and Indiana, and into the Middle West. And here is what a rivel is. You put flour in a bowl with a pinch of salt, you break in an egg, and then you rub the mixture between your fingers. Just rub it, until it falls into little ragged crumbs and shreds. No two alike, some like rice, some like buttons. Those are rivels. And then you drop them, bit by bit, into a pot of simmering milk, or milk and broth, sometimes with corn in it, and they cook in a few minutes into tender little dumplings, hundreds of them, thickening the soup as they go, until what you have is a pot of creamy, pillowy, gently satisfying soup made from flour, an egg, and milk, which is to say made from almost nothing at all. Grandmothers taught granddaughters to rub rivels the way they taught them to braid hair, hands over hands at the kitchen table, and a 5-year-old could do it and be proud, standing on her chair, raining rivels into the pot while her grandmother stirred. That was the real recipe, if you want to know. The flour and the egg were only the ingredients. The recipe was the two of them at the stove together, the little one learning that she could feed people, that her hands could make comfort out of a cupboard that looked empty. There are women watching right now who learned it exactly that way, and I would wager their eyes are stinging a little, remembering whose hands were over theirs. Rivel soup never had a fancy day in its life, never appeared on a single restaurant menu, and outside the old communities it has been forgotten so completely that most Americans have never even heard the word. But the pot remembers. But the next one was not one recipe at all. It was every recipe, and it lived on the back of the stove all week long. They called it end of the garden soup, or everything soup, or just the soup pot. And in many a household during the lean years, it never really stopped. It began on Monday, maybe, with a bone and an onion and water, and then it lived, changing as the week changed, growing as the kitchen gave. The outer leaves of the cabbage went in, the ones we throw away now, the tops of the celery, the pod strings of the peas, the tomato that had gone soft on one side, the last 3 green beans, the potato that was more eyes than potato, the heel of yesterday's pot roast if the week had been rich, the water the vegetables had boiled in if it had been poor, because that water had food value and the women knew it, and they would no more pour it down the drain than pour milk down. Every noon and every evening, the pot offered what it had, and what it had was always different, and always the same, hot, savory, and sufficient. Come late summer, it earned its name in earnest, when the garden came in all at once, and the pot took the whole tide of it, and come canning time, whatever the jars couldn't hold, the pot held. This was the oldest cooking in the world, older than recipes, the perpetual pot of every peasant kitchen in every century. And the Depression simply reminded America how to do it. Nothing wasted, nothing wanted. A family fed all week from a pot that cost, if you sat down and figured it, almost nothing at all. Our grandmothers could weep at what a modern kitchen throws away in a week, and they would be right to, and somewhere deep down, in the part of us that is them, we know it. But the next one was supper and dessert in the same bowl, and it was what a mother made when the cupboard had come down to its last 2 blessings. Rice and milk, sweet rice, some families called it, or rice porridge, or just rice pudding made poor, and it was the supper of the nights at the very bottom of the barrel, and somehow, ask anyone who ate it, it is remembered as a treat. A cup of rice into the pot, milk in over it, and it simmered low and slow, stirred often so it wouldn't catch, while the rice drank the milk and gave back its starch until the whole pot went thick and creamy like a hug. Then sugar, if there was sugar, or a ribbon of molasses or honey if there wasn't, and cinnamon shaken over the top in the houses that had cinnamon, and it was ladled warm into bowls and eaten by lamplight, and the children went to bed with warm, full stomachs, which was the entire ambition of the age. Mothers served it without a word of apology, and children received it without a thought of pity, because warm, sweet, and creamy does not feel like poverty to a 7-year-old. It feels like being tucked in. And on the coldest nights, some mothers set the filled bowls on the open oven door to keep them warm while the children washed up for bed. And that picture, the little curl of steam rising off a white bowl in a dim kitchen, is one that more than a few of you are seeing right now, clear as a photograph, 60 and 70 years on. Some families ate it cold for breakfast the next day, the leftover pot gone firm in the night, with a little more milk over it, and that was good too. Everything was good when it was gone, which is the truest review a supper can earn. Rice and milk was the meal that asked the least of the world and gave the most back. And in the sweep of things, it may be the oldest dish in this whole list, because mothers have been simmering grain in milk for their children since before anybody wrote anything down. Now, friends, before we lift the last lid, thank you for staying beside the stove with me this whole while. If these old pots have stirred something in you, I hope you will subscribe and keep us company, because there are so many more tables to go back to together. But the next one, the last one, is the one I promised you at the beginning. It was the Sunday pot. It was the celebration. And in the hardest years this country ever saw, it was what love looked like with the lid off. Chicken and dumplings. There it is. You knew it was coming, didn't you? The way you knew it was coming on a Sunday morning when you were small, when the smell found you before you were all the way through the kitchen door. In the Depression, a chicken was not groceries. A chicken was capital. The hens in the yard were the family's little factory, turning scraps into eggs, and the eggs into egg money, which was the money a farm wife controlled herself, that bought the shoes and the school books and the thread. So the family did not eat a laying hen for no reason. But when a hen got old and stopped laying, or when the preacher was coming to dinner, or when it was a birthday or a homecoming, or one of those Sundays when a mother simply decided her family needed to feel rich for an hour, then the pot came out, the big one, and the old hen went in with an onion and salt and water, and she simmered half the day, because an old hen is tough, and only time can gentle her. And while she simmered, she gave up everything she had, and what she had was the richest, deepest, most golden broth in this world. And then came the dumplings. And here the country divided itself as it always does, between the fluffy people and the slick people, the ones whose dumplings were dropped from a spoon and steamed up light as clouds, and the ones whose dumplings were rolled thin and cut in strips and slipped into the broth like noodles' country cousins, and both sides were right, and neither will ever admit it. The dumplings were flour and a little fat, and milk, which is to say, the dumplings were the stretch, the multiplication, the trick that turned one old hen into supper for 10, 12, 14 people, everybody served, everybody filled, the meat doled out fair, and the dumplings without limit. Grandma stood at that pot with her wooden spoon like a bishop with a crozier, and she served every plate at that table before her own, and if you looked, and children always look, you saw that her plate had the back and the neck and one dumpling, and she ate it like it was the best piece, and she said so, and she meant it, because to her it was, because everyone she loved was fed and at her table, and for that 1 hour the depression could not touch them. That is the meal. That is the one the others were all leading to. Chicken and dumplings on a Sunday in a poorhouse was proof, laid steaming in the middle of the table, that hard times can take nearly everything, but they cannot take the table itself. That's the pot that takes you back. That's the flavor that time forgot. And we should say plainly, before we go, that not every memory of those years is a warm one, and it would not be honest to pretend otherwise. There were bread lines in the cities, block after block of men with their collars up. There were children who went to bed hungry, and mothers who went hungrier so they wouldn't. Out on the plains the dust came and took the farms whole, and families packed the truck and drove west with everything they owned roped to the sideboards. The meals we remembered today were not quaint choices. They were victories, small daily victories won by women with almost nothing in their hands. And when the hard years finally ended and the war came, those same women took their thrift straight into the ration books and fed the country all over again. So when we smile at a pot of Hoover stew, we are not smiling at the suffering. We are tipping our hats to the ones who beat it, one supper at a time. And here is the remarkable part. Most of them never said a word about it afterward. You had to pry the stories out of them decades later at some anniversary dinner, and even then, they would wave a hand and say, "Oh, everybody was in the same boat. We managed, we got by." They did not call it heroism, that generation. They called it Tuesday. Thank you for spending this hour beside the old stove with me, and for remembering along with me. These 20 pots were never written up in the fancy magazines, and most of them never had a recipe card, because the women who made them carried the recipes in their hands. But they held this country together, one table at a time, through the worst it ever had to bear, and the least we can do is remember them out loud and say thank you to the pots and to the hands and to the love that stirred them. If this brought back even one warm kitchen for you, please do subscribe and stay with us here at Forgotten Flavors, so we can keep these memories alive together. And next time, we are going back to the sweet side of those same hard years, the desserts the Depression invented out of thin air, the vinegar pies and the water pies and the cakes made with no eggs, no milk, and no butter that still tasted like a celebration, because our grandmothers refused to let the hard times have the last word, especially at dessert. Until then, take good care of yourself, hold your memories close, and remember, here we remember the flavors that time forgot. We'll see you next time.